everyone. I'm John Evans, and welcome to the first episode of One-on-One for this new year. The COVID-19 pandemic has shut down most of the live entertainment industry. Concerts and live shows haven't happened since the pandemic began and likely won't happen on a large scale for quite some time. And that has kept Cliff Cash from entertaining audiences in person with his stand-up comedy. Earlier this month, Cliff released a brand new comedy album called Halfway There. It was to entertain his current fans and to hopefully bring in a lot of new fans. Well, that new album spent 3 days at #1 on the iTunes comedy charts. Quite the accomplishment. Cliff does have a special coming up that kind of takes you behind the scenes of that material. We'll have more on how you can watch the special coming up in a little while. But first, we're going to hear from Cliff how he got into stand-up comedy and how his older brother Wiley, who was a New York Times best-selling author, influenced his career along the way. Chart-topping comedian Cliff Cash, we welcome you to the One-on-One with John Evans podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
We appreciate you joining us. You released Halfway There January the 8th, and it spent 3 days at #1 on the iTunes comedy chart. Tell me about what that does for the confidence of a performer, somebody who really literally bears their soul out there on stage on a regular basis.
I think it's definitely some validation, and it feels good to just sort of achieve that #1 spot. But it was really great validation just to get an album released with that record label. They've done albums for Patton Oswalt, Hannibal Buress, David Cross, Mark Maron. So a lot of really great comics, Maria Bamford. So that alone is kind of like, things happen in comedy from time to time that just sort of lets you know, like, you're not crazy for going for it. It's like somebody famous goes, "Man, that was really funny," and you're like, "Yeah, I'm not going to give up yet."
Yeah,
so.
Well, I must say you're the first chart topper I've ever interviewed, so I thank you for taking the time.
Oh yeah.
Now this is material you shot and recorded 5 years ago at Dead Crow. So what plans did you have for it? What were you going to do with it, and what was it, just kind of sitting around and then you got the idea, hey, let's try this?
So at the time, I kind of had a lot of irons in the fire with comedy. I had a tour that I was working on with 2 other comedians, and it was going really well. And we were getting a lot of press coverage and just a lot of traction. So I kind of thought that we were probably on the precipice of releasing something together. So I didn't want to put this hour out and then immediately release that material again with our tour. So that was kind of why I didn't do anything with it initially. And then I actually did self-release it several years ago, and just didn't have the traction and the resources of a real record label, so it just didn't do that much. And I was at a show. I was actually at a comedy festival called Altercation Comedy Festival, and I was closing out one of the showcases, and Dan Schlissel, who owns Stand Up Records, was in the crowd. And after the show, he just said to me, he said, "Funny stuff, smart stuff. I'm a fan." And that was it. And
a man of few words, apparently.
Yeah. And and he's a tough crowd. Everybody that he signs on the label are sort of higher brow comedians, sort of doing that a little bit more cerebral material. So I felt really great about that. And he and I were actually already friends on Facebook. And so I just sent him a message and I said, I've got this old hour. It's a little bit older. It's a little bit dated, but I'm proud of it. And would you be interested in releasing it for me? And he watched it and he liked it. And so here we are.
Nice. Now, there's a lot of Wilmington-related material on it, North Carolina-related material. Was there any concern that it might not have the widespread popularity because you talk about Market Street and you talk about Carolina Beach? So were there any concerns about that?
A little bit. And had I been planning better when I recorded the hour, I might not have mentioned that stuff. But I've had so many people from Wilmington and from North Carolina messaged me since it came out, and
Oh yeah.
and they all say, "Oh man, I love the Wilmington material. It's hilarious." So I think I think it's all relative. I mean, everybody is from somewhere, and there's that conversation in every town of this road is awful. Somebody please clean up Market Street. So I think people relate to it regardless, but yeah, it's pretty specific.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that nowadays, no matter where you drive, you can see that person in the Statue of Liberty costume outside the tax preparer's office.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not just something Market Street related. You don't hide a lot about yourself, Cliff. If you go to the Stand Up Records site, it says, Cliff Cash doesn't want to alarm you, but as a North Carolina native, with a mom who speaks in tongues, a dad who worked as a pit crews in NASCAR's dirt track days, and a lesbian big sister, he's starting to think TV might not be making Southerners look good. You put a lot of yourself out there in that one paragraph. So you got to be confident in your ability to get up there and say, look past this is who I am.
Yeah, and I think that took me a long time as a comic. When I first got into comedy, I did not talk about myself, and I couldn't get there. I couldn't get that vulnerable, and so it sort of took a while to build up to that. And now that I have gotten to that point, I really feel like it's made my stand-up a lot more authentic and enjoyable. And I feel good about it. It's a lot of what I'm doing now, this newer hour since that recording, is talking about some difficult life experiences, infidelity, divorce, my dad passing away, financial hardship. And so they're really heavy topics. And I bring the crowd real low energetically. And occasionally I'll see somebody wiping their eyes, and then I come in and it's joke. And so it's a really kind of emotional roller coaster. But I just love doing that kind of material because it's so challenging to me. And I think a lot of people aren't doing that. And so, comedy kind of has different levels, and it takes you a while to get comfortable with different things. But the comedy that I'm doing now, to me, is not only putting myself out there, but putting the very heaviest stuff out there and dissecting it and trying to find the humor in all of it.
Well, who knows? Maybe they get an extra beer or something like that to deal with that downtime.
Exactly.
before you pick them up a little bit. You get a cut of the bar tab that night. It'd be a good thing. Did you have to maybe talk to your sister or family members about being able to use some of their experiences?
I probably should have, but what I ended up doing was just asking for forgiveness instead of permission.
That's always easier to do, right?
Yeah. And I actually got to do some of that material in front of my sister last year before COVID. And, I just basically I talk about, my sister's gay, and she came out to me when I was 15 years old. And that was really difficult for my parents because they're really conservative, evangelical Christian. My dad's passed away now, but it was hard on them. And being the other sibling in the middle of that is like parents on one end, gay sister on the other end, and you have to navigate between these two very different people that you love very much. You're not going to give up on either end of the spectrum. So it made me and my brother kind of peacemakers, and we had to sort of navigate that and be able to talk to both of them and try and sort of bridge the gap. And but when my dad got sick and my sister came and took care of him and was kind of his primary caretaker because she was a hospice nurse, and it was just this display of kindness and this like unconditional love. And so that's what I talk about on stage, is even though they went through all this hard stuff, my sister was able to really love unconditionally. And it's, I don't know, not very funny, but it's good when I'm doing it on stage. I pack some jokes in there,
Well, I mean, and some of the stuff that I saw when you're talking about her and then you give it a beat and you say where she's going to end up. I mean,
Right.
that's a, if you do it the right way and if they know about it and okay with it, I imagine, then you're confident in being able to do it on stage.
Yeah, yeah, and that's that kind of material that I'm doing now. I enjoy that so much because I'm bringing that energy so far down, and people. I mean, I think people are literally thinking like, "What is he doing? Why is he doing this?" And then I come in and there's some big jokes that are kind of a big payoff at the end of those bits. So it's certainly the most challenging kind of comedy I've done. So I think that's sort of growth as a comedian when you can get to the point where you've kind of figured out comedy at least to some degree, and now you want to challenge yourself with some other kind of form of it.
Yep. All right, let's bring in your brother here who just wanted to get in. Wiley, I'm going to go to you now since you've joined us.
Okay.
When did you first see Cliff on stage? And was there one of those things where he was talking about some family events that you went, uh-oh, mom, dad, sis might not like this?
I can't remember the first time I actually saw Cliff on a stage at a comedy club on a proper stage. I feel like all of my life, at one point or another, I've been watching Cliff on stage, whether it's, telling stories around the table at Thanksgiving or entertaining a broken down busload of senior citizens during a Mardi Gras parade. I witnessed that as well. So it's been something that I've always been, aware of and always been witness to. So the first time I saw him on a formal stage, I can't even think of when that would have been. I'm sure it probably was here in Wilmington. I'm sure it was at Dead Crow, probably the old Dead Crow, the old Nut Street venue. But it's never been a surprise to me. It's never been something I've ever had to get used to. When people bring it up or people, mention it to me, I'm never that surprised by it.
Now, obviously, you both do different kinds of writing. And Cliff, I did some research where you said that people who obviously know Wiley's writing might be surprised to know how funny he is. But yeah. Wiley, what's tougher, writing the novels or writing a good joke?
I think, and I'm not just saying this because Cliff's here, but I think writing comedy is much more difficult than writing, drama or melodrama or horror, because comedy is based on more than just humor. All humor is based on someone else's pain, either the comedian's pain or the victim's pain, the victim of the humor. And so in order to have humor, you also have to have drama. And in order to have drama, you only have to have drama. And so there are more components moving in concert when you're trying to set up a joke, deliver a joke, carry a joke forward into the next, setup, returning to a joke. I always tell my students when I teach creative writing that it's easy to make them sad, but it's really hard to get an honest laugh on the page or on stage.
Wiley paid you some pretty high compliments there, Cliff. How funny is your brother?
He's pretty funny. He's actually hosted a couple of shows for me in Wilmington, and we've done events together too that were more focused around his writing and stuff. But the events that he's hosted, the shows that he's hosted for me in Wilmington, I was upstairs like, all right, dude, that's enough. Like you've been funny now for 15 minutes. Like now you're just showing off. Let's keep the show going. But no, the first time we did that together, he was calling me and he's like, all right, let me run this joke by you. And he would kind of run it by me. And, it's hard for something to really hit through the phone, and especially if you're not used to performing stand-up. So he's telling me these premises and I'm like, yeah, that's all right. That's pretty good. But then when I saw him perform them, he did great. The crowd was like really digging it. And yeah, pretty impressive first comedy experience. He does a lot of public speaking, so he's pretty used to, he's got good timing and all of that.
What was it like growing up in Gastonia, Cliff? What was it like growing up in the family? Obviously, Dad was involved, you said, in the NASCAR, very conservative family. But what were your dreams? What did you want to do when you were growing up?
This is going to sound a little bit weird, but I think until I was about 10 years old, every time someone would ask me that, I would say that I wanted to be a monkey. And I might have hit my head when I was little, but I loved climbing. I just like stayed in trees literally. And but I think later, as I started to have some of my own thoughts, I really wanted to be Bruce Willis from Die Hard 1. I think that was really my main career goal.
That's something nice to strive for.
Yeah. I just wanted to be a hero, but that never really worked out. So I didn't know, I think as a kid I had like these lofty dreams, and as I got older, I became more and more cynical and less optimistic that I could achieve those things that seemed sort of big and abstract. When I was a kid, I kind of wanted to be an actor, and but I didn't do a whole lot to pursue that. I think by the time I was college age, I thought, oh, I better pursue something a little more serious and dependable. And so I think I got a little bit tamped down by the world, a little bit jaded, and I think honestly, I tried to be a regular grown-up for several years, owned a couple businesses and had a sales job and did some real estate stuff. And it just wasn't for me. I felt very caged up and anchored the whole time,
You both didn't you both go to UNC Asheville?
Yes.
And what did you study?
I studied girls and beer and sleeping late and missing class and getting parking tickets, getting in trouble. Wiley was like the valedictorian or the president of the class or whatever. And I was like the guy who shouldn't be drinking during the day. So we're very different in that regard. But
Wiley, what was it like to have your younger brother on campus?
It was he'd been on campus before. He came to visit me beginning my freshman year. I think in school I was 3 years older than him. So my senior year of college was his freshman year of college. So by the time Cliff arrived as a student, he already had a long history as a visitor, you could say. And he had made himself welcome both on and off campus. So he already had a network of friends, and his name certainly preceded him. So it was interesting having him on campus for that year. As Cliff said, I was student body president, and that was advantageous sometimes for Cliff's freshman year of college in terms of administration and public safety and some of those things. But even when I went to graduate school in Louisiana, I went to graduate school in Lafayette, Louisiana, and Cliff would come down from Mardi Gras. And in the weeks leading up to Mardi Gras, all my friends would be asking, is your brother coming this year? Is he coming back? Is Cliff coming? Is he going to drive? Is he going to fly? Is he bringing anybody with him? What can we expect in terms of Cliff arriving from Mardi Gras? So that's always been something, and it's been that way since we were kids. I've always been, at least in groups, a little quieter, a little more reserved, and I've always been, kind of aware of where the party is.
So the crowds have been clamoring for him for decades, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, without sounding, over the top or ridiculous, yeah, that's certainly true. Cliff's always, had a lot of friends and attracted a lot of people, and that's kind of always been the case, and that's always been kind of part of the dynamic between the two of us.
When he got into comedy full time, I mean, he said he had some of the other jobs, but when he really started to get into comedy on a full time basis, could you see it being a career for him at that point?
Yeah, it depends on what you think a career is going to be. I've been writing professionally since my first book came out in 2012, but I do a lot of stuff on the side. I teach, I do speaking gigs, I do magazine work, I do a lot of things on the side. And so Cliff's forged a career as a full-time comic, but he also has gigs on the side, and so I always knew he could do it. And do I think that he could get a Netflix special or a Comedy Central special and start headlining major clubs? Absolutely. Because I've seen friends of mine or friends of his do that. And I've seen friends of mine who are writers who toiled in obscurity for a decade and a half suddenly have major novels and major breakthrough experiences. And so, it's the kind of thing when you're pursuing something you're passionate about, you do it because you love the work, not because of the success that it brings. Because success is a hard thing to measure, especially in today's age, especially in terms of the gig economy and artistic endeavor. You know, there's no one waiting to pay you at the end of a 40-hour work week for writing jokes or writing novels. And I think both of us have grown accustomed to that. And luckily, we both do know how to do a whole bunch of things, and we've kind of done that. You know, we had parents who worked. My dad, our dad worked for Refco and then CVS for like 75 years, and they treated him like trash. And we've never been satisfied to stay in any kind of work that didn't bring us joy. And so we've always tried all these different things.
Cliff, doing it in front of friends is one thing. Maybe, you know, doing it in front of a class is one thing. Can you tell me what sparked you to actually maybe get up on stage for that first time and what it was like on stage that first time? Because it's a different dynamic when you're actually doing it to earn money versus doing it just for fun.
First time I did it, I had gone to Nut Street Comedy Room the week before and watched the open mic. And I met the owner, Timmy Sherrill, when I got there. And he and I are still good buddies. And just really liked him a lot. We talked and kind of had rapport, and he told me how it all worked, and I said maybe I'll try it next week. And so halfway through the night, I'd had a couple cocktails and was feeling funny, and I went back to him and I was just begging him, like, please let me get up there, please. And he said, no, that's not how it works. You got to show up at this time and you get on the list and you wait for your name to be called. And I'm so glad that he didn't let me, because I think I would have been the guy with a buzz that didn't really have anything to say yet.
Right.
And it probably would have failed, and I probably would not have tried again. Mm-hmm. So the next week I showed up and I worked on my set every day for a week. At the time I owned a recycling business, and the guys that were working for me were all friends of mine. So I would be driving a recycling truck with my little notepad, like, running my jokes by my buddies, and they're like, we get it, man, it's funny, don't tell me again.
So that's ironic, you're recycling humor as a recycling business, but exactly. I diverge. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I worked on the bits every day for a week. I had a callback. You know, it was kind of political out of the gate. I mentioned Sarah Palin and a couple social issues, and I think I was so ready. The material was so ready when I got up there for the first time. It went really well. And again, had it not, I'm not sure I would have tried it again, but it went really well, and I was hooked immediately. But waiting to go on stage, I literally felt like my heart was going to explode. I mean, I was like my breathing was rapid. My heart's just banging out of my chest.
And people ask me, I've been in TV news now more than 35 years, and they still ask me, do you still get nervous? And I say, if I'm not a little bit nervous, then it's not good. You should be a little bit nervous every time you go out there, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. Now, the feeling that I feel is more of a sort of a subtle and controlled excitement.
Right.
I love being on stage. As I'm waiting to go up there, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to doing this new joke, or I know this old joke I've been doing forever is going to kill in this room. The only time I get nervous in the conventional sense is if I'm going up in front of a really small crowd. If there's 30 people in a room that really holds 200 people, then I'm like, oh, this is going to be brutal.
Yeah.
It's almost like the more full the crowd is, the less nervous I am, because I know it's going to go well. And then I'll get a little nervous if there's something at stake, if it's a competition or something for TV. But for the most part, I just feel excited, and I feel really lucky to be able to do it too.
I interviewed Brian Granger for my podcast a couple of years ago. He won Port City's top comic competition a couple of years. I interviewed Basil, the comedian. Both of them told me that they learned from other comedians. Not that they took something or not that they imitated, but they learned. Is it still a learning process for you now, almost a decade in?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a fine line. You've got to, you can sort of take something structurally, maybe from someone's timing or their writing structure. But it's a fine line. You want to make sure you're not taking on anyone else's style or delivery or ideas. But I loved stand-up comedy growing up, and I would watch specials. I would say probably in my teenage years, junior high and high school, Chris Rock was my favorite comedian. And Wiley and I both watched those specials so many times that we had big parts of it memorized. And so I think when I started doing it, I was so familiar with watching it. I understood timing, at least to some degree. Right. I knew what a callback was, even though I didn't know what it was called. So I kind of knew some of those fundamental elements, and that helped me to start writing and it feel, like it's in correct form.
What did you learn from your brother?
I would say the most important thing I learned from Wiley is, I kind of started trying stand-up just after he got his first 2-book deal. And I think it really inspired me. And he'll tell you, leading up to getting the 2-book deal, it was a lot of people said no. And, a couple agents, and he was constantly submitting to literary journals and wasn't having the kind of luck that he was hoping for, but he didn't give up. He kept going for it. And that's when he got the agent that he has now. And he, in very short order, got him a 2-book deal. And it was huge. And that first book was a New York Times bestseller. It was an Oprah magazine, all kinds of publications, and won awards all over the world. And I think just seeing somebody that I know that closely and intimately really go for it and not give up, it made me think like, well, maybe I can do this thing that I really love. Like maybe I can really do it. There's people do all the time. People succeed at something that they've dreamed about. And I think the trick, not to be a motivational speaker or sound cheesy, but I think the trick to all of it is you just don't give up. You just, whether it's a marriage or a business or a business idea or your art or your passion, if you just stay with it, you'll either succeed or you'll die trying. And that's a life well lived if you've done the thing that you love your whole life.
Did you see your brother kind of learning along the way and kind of taking that nose to the grindstone kind of mentality as he started to get into it, that he didn't give up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are a couple of components to being successful at something like being a comedian or being a writer or being an artist of any kind. And the first and most important is talent. Cliff talked about watching a lot of the well-known comedians that he, got ideas from or learned structure or things like that. But he mentioned timing, and I would disagree a little bit that timing is something that you can't really learn because it's such an intuitive thing. And I've watched Cliff not only on stage, but just telling stories in a group of people and sensing lulls in the story where the energy has to be brought up or when the tone has to be dropped. And that's the kind of thing you can't really teach. You can teach someone the segmented portions of a joke. Here's the introduction, here's the turn of the joke, here's the callback, as Cliff talked about that term. But to really feel the nuances and open yourself up to an audience or to a listener, that's something you can't really teach. And what you also can't teach is this doggedness that you referenced, John, in your question, and this unwillingness to give up. And it's not just a doggedness in writing jokes every day or constantly working to refine your material. It's a doggedness and determination that leads you to walk away from a job and drive across the country several times a year playing comedy venues that may or may not make your career or make ends meet that month. It's just a willingness to continually put yourself out there and risk, a great reward or great disappointment or failure. And that's really what any kind of art is. It's talent and creativity married to an intense desire to succeed or to improve. And as we talked about earlier, what does success look like? I don't know. I think success looks like good work. And I think that's something that both Cliff and I have been pretty convicted with.
Well, I think, you bring up a good point in, some people might see topping the iTunes chart as being successful. Others might see a 25 or a 30-year career being successful. I think it's all in what you bring to want to that success.
Sure.
I'm 35 years in TV. I would consider myself, I never thought it would last that long, I would consider myself somewhat successful in this genre. Yourself the same way. And I get the sense from talking to Cliff that just some of the things he's overcome and gotten to, he would look at himself in the mirror and say, yeah, I'm pretty successful.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. Cliff's had a lot of great ideas and a lot of great business ventures that he's, seen all the way through to the very end. And he's picked up a lifetime worth of skills, both intellectual skills and utilitarian skills, more physical skills. And, I think, being number one on iTunes is certainly a marker of success, but I guarantee you that seeing his album number one on iTunes probably doesn't feel as good as the first time he left the stage after a successful set here in Wilmington. Because again, I think the payoff for both of us is just the feeling of good work having been done. And, I know with myself, when I signed my first book deal, my wife and I decided that was the best it was ever going to be. Nothing would ever feel better than that, because that was what we had wanted. We had wanted that measure of an acknowledgement of a job well done. And Cliff can get that from an audience. And I had never really had that from a readership, and getting a book contract felt that way. It felt like somebody was finally saying, okay, you've been, kind of working in the dark for a couple of decades, and now this is being acknowledged. And so again, seeing those markers of success feel good, but then it's going to be the next thing. What's the next charge that you get? There's an old saying that here in the South, we're either on drugs or we're on religion, because everybody here in the South, we want that charge. We want that next thing that shocks us to move ahead. Some people get it from church. Some people get it from drugs. I get it from sitting down at the desk and being very quiet. Cliff gets it in smoky bars and on the road across the country, getting laughs from audiences. And
I get it from Sundrop.
What's going or Sundrop, yeah.
Cliff, what's funny to you?
Oh man, that's a tough year to answer that question.
Oh, I know it is.
Almost everything.
And that's another thing I want to talk about here in a minute. But what is funny?
I think to me, it started out as what's absurd, like using humor to take something that I think is absurd and really dissecting the absurdity of it. And whether that's like a fanatical talking point, conspiracy theory, something like QAnon or whatever. I like to use comedy to sort of unpack things and break them down, and use sarcasm to show how ridiculous some of these thought processes are. And I've sort of realized that when I first started comedy, I wasn't skilled enough to avoid this, but a lot of the comedy at first was sort of more at someone else's expense. I mean, never real hateful or anything, but right. Just, it would be tell a story about this stranger that had on this weird outfit, or somebody in traffic, but it was always like, look how dumb this is. And I think one of the things that I learned, what I was sort of saying earlier, is learning to talk about myself and my own life, and to just be funny where it doesn't have to be at someone else's expense. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's the expense of an idea, but not a particular person. And so as I've learned to navigate that, I've gotten to where I can go and do an hour in a room where I know probably 80% of the people there don't agree with my social and political views, my worldview, but I've gotten good enough at sort of slipping the material into their ears without saying the words I know will trigger them, like the T word.
Right.
Tiny brain. I know you're probably wondering what it was. But I'll avoid certain words that I know are going to trigger and upset people. And so instead of doing a joke about a political party, I'll do a joke about racism. And really it's the same joke, but I'm using words that I know I can get away with. Because nobody wants to stand up in an audience and go, I don't appreciate you making fun of racists. All my favorite people are racist. Nobody's going to do that. Almost never. Similar things have happened, but so I think that you can sort of make people think, and you can say almost anything you want to, if you're clever enough to slip it in there and take the edges off of it and make it, palatable for whoever your audience happens to be.
Do people want to know from you kind of how the sausage is made? People, I mean, even to this day, somebody will come up to me, well, you don't go into the TV station till 5 minutes before your newscast. You sit down and people do all the work for you, right? Isn't that how it works? Right. What I'm asking is, do they want to know how you struggle maybe to write a joke, or do they just want to hear you tell the joke?
I think the average audience that's showing up for a show, just for the most part, just wants to be entertained. And for me, that is always my number one priority. A lot of comedians don't feel that way. A lot of comedians will say, I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do, whether they like it or not, because this is my art form. This is my material. Mm-hmm. They're not always going to like it. And I respect that courage. But for me, I know what it's like to be in the audience and at a time where I really needed to laugh. I went and saw Jerry Seinfeld live with my two oldest friends the day after my dad's funeral. And that was a really profound experience for me, because I've been in the audience of plenty of comedy, but never on a day when I needed it that much. And to sit there with two people that I love as much as anyone and watch this legend of a comedian, I needed that so bad. I mean, it was like such it turned me around so much energetically, and it just felt good to smile and laugh. And so for me, I know that no matter what I'm going through, there's probably somebody in the audience who lost a parent or a spouse or a kid, or is going through a divorce, or is losing their house or losing a job or whatever. And so to me, my first obligation is to try to do everything I can to make the people that are there have a good time for an hour and forget about whatever's going on in their life,
Now, we've had obviously the circumstances surrounding what's happened in the past year. You've got this new material out, and normally when artists release material, they go out on tour to try to support it. What's your plans? I know you told me you and Wiley have an event coming up, but what are you going to try to do here until you can start getting out into venues again?
Well, Wiley and I are doing this event January 31st. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to play my album, parts of my album that just came out, halfway there. We're going to play certain jokes, and we're going to kind of dissect the writing process. And we're going to talk about just little heckles during the show, where the material came from, and then just kind of some banter with us, just some storytelling, funny stuff we've done. A lot of it we can't probably repeat because of legal reasons, but we'll say what we can without getting in trouble. But so that's about as close as anybody's going to be able to see me doing stand-up anytime soon. I did a couple club weekends this fall in October, and to be honest, it felt a little reckless to do. And the crowds were they were only allowed to be like a quarter of what they normally are.
Right.
So it's a 3/4 empty room. People are spaced apart. They've got masks on. You leave the comedy club at night and the streets are empty. It's just not the same. And to me, I love stand-up so much that I just don't want to do some watered down version of it. I want to wait until it comes back and go full speed. But I'm doing everything I can to promote this album and sell as many of them as I can. And I recorded a special this fall for Dry Bar, which is the biggest stand-up comedy content creator in the world. So I'm trying to still make moves kind of behind the scenes, right, and keep some momentum in my career. But it's been tough. I mean, I lost basically my entire income for 2020. And so I've been sort of falling back on other skills. I've been renovating houses, and I also sell my photography. And so I've got a lot of little side hustles that are keeping me afloat, but I would much rather be on stage and driving around the country. That feels the most natural to me.
Wiley, what do you hope folks get out of the event on the 31st?
What I really hope people get is, first of all, I hope, to be quite honest, that they'll be interested in purchasing either Cliff's comedy album halfway there off a platform like iTunes or Amazon or somewhere like that, or getting the full video special, which you can rent or buy on Vimeo. And I think we're going to show these video excerpts and then talk about them. So I think beyond the financials of supporting, live comedy at a time, when comedians like Cliff are not being supported. What I really hope they get is an idea of the effort that goes into making a joke look effortless. We're going to show 3 or 4 excerpts of jokes, and some of his jokes are long. I think especially more recently, Cliff is not only a comedian, he's more of a storyteller, performance artist. And so some of these jokes are long and they're drawn out, and they have a lot of moments where the comedy rises and gets hit on and returned to. And it looks like, narrative storytelling, but in reality, it's a very structured, premeditated attempt at achieving some kind of laugh at a particular time. And to show an audience that, and then to come out and talk about it in the concrete and say, here's what I was thinking, here's why I said this when I said it. And then with me asking questions of it, and then maybe even bringing in my own experience of being a writer and setting up, how do you reach for a certain emotion that you want to achieve? That's what I think people are going to really get from it is a real insight into how intricate and how difficult this process is, but also how beneficial it is to the comedian and to the audience.
And Cliff, where can people see this event on the 31st?
It's on Wiley's, the link to purchase tickets for the event is on Wiley's website, wileycash.com. And it's under the shop button, I think, isn't it, Wiley?
Yeah, people can just go to wileycash.com/comedy and then get tickets right there. wileycash.com/comedy. It's the only time you will ever find anything comedic or funny on my website.
Well, I mean, I thought it was interesting. As I was doing some of the research, I read some things, interviews with Cliff, and he talked about how funny you were, Wiley, and I'm trying to envision you being up on stage.
Yeah, and I think the stuff in my book is, in terms of humor, a scale of 1 to 10, it's like a 1. And I think my books are a little notorious for being a bit dramatic and a little dark, and so I have to have a little bit of humor in there to rescue, some of the heavier emotions, but also to make those emotions seem as heavy as they are, because right, without a little bit of lightness, you're not aware of how dramatic and how tedious life can be sometimes. But Cliff mentioned earlier in the discussion about when I've opened for him at events, and I've done that twice. I hosted a fundraiser that we did just before the pandemic to raise some money for a political organization, and then Cliff did a live show here in Wilmington. I want to say it was in the fall of 2019 or the spring of 2018. Maybe the spring of 2019, and I hosted the show and I opened the show, and that was as nervous as I've probably done 1,000 speaking events since my books have been out in the past decade or so, and I've never been one bit nervous, because I'm talking about material I know, I'm talking about my writing process, I'm talking about the books that I write or what I've studied. But to get up and completely conjure comedy in the moment, even though I had written and practiced these jokes, it was a level of nerves and pressure that I have never experienced before. Even my wife, who's seen me do hundreds of events, was beside herself. Like, she didn't want to go because she was so nervous that it wasn't going to go well, nervous on my behalf. So it's a different thing to get up and have the responsibility of lifting an audience. That's really what it is. You know, the audience isn't laughing when you get on stage, and you really have to make everything happen right there. It's like making a campfire in front of an audience, and them judging how you're doing it and maybe whispering to each other just loud enough for you to hear it on the stage. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of personalities in the room to manage, from the bar to the promoter to the opener to the host to the audience individual members. I mean, it's a big responsibility, and it's an incredible amount of pressure.
And Cliff, all the success that you have had coming up till now, if folks want to see some of your shows, you got a lot of videos on YouTube as well, along with this brand new release, right?
I do. Pretty much all of my social media is Cliff Cash Comedy. And the one that I spend the most time on is Instagram. I take a lot of photos of my travels, a lot of national park photography, and just nature photography in general. And then I've got a bunch of short videos on Instagram as well that are pretty recent. And then also YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff. But
yeah, I went on and watched a lot of them, of doing some research for this, and it really takes a lot of guts to get up there on stage and bare your soul like that.
Well, thank you. And, you know, people will say that to me a lot. I'll have a friend who's a dividends trader, or I got a friend that's a physician, and they go, man, that's just so hard. How do you do that? And I say, well, it's a lot easier than being a physician. It's like, and if you're the class clown type of character, it doesn't feel scary or hard. It feels very natural. And it was scary at first, but now I honestly, being on stage is probably when I feel the most myself and the most comfortable and the most sort of in my element. So I think it's just a matter of what comes naturally to you. And I think that when I found stand-up and I realized I really felt like I was meant to do it, then I felt this really strong obligation to do it, not just for myself, but for everybody else in the world and the universe, and what, because most people, or a lot of people, just they don't ever kind of totally figure out what their thing is, and so people just work to work and work to live, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you are one of the people who's lucky enough to figure out what you're meant to do, I feel like you really owe it to the rest of the universe to do it.
Yeah, I'm one of I fit in there with you. I realized at a young age I was blessed with the good Lord blessed me with a big mouth, and if I didn't talk for a living, I wouldn't be happy doing it. I've been in radio since 15 and TV since 22, so I'm right there along with you. It doesn't feel like work if you're enjoying what you do. Yeah,
that's a real blessing for sure.
All right, well, Cliff, I appreciate you taking the time. Congratulations on the success. And Wiley, I appreciate your insights to your brother and telling us a little bit more about how successful he's been. Guys, it's been a real blast today, and I appreciate you both joining us.
Oh, of course.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
A big thanks once again to Cliff Cash and his brother Wiley for joining us for this week's podcast. And now, as promised, more details on how you can watch Cliff's upcoming special on Halfway There. It's Sunday night, January 31st at 8 o'clock. You need a ticket to see it. To get one of the tickets, you can go to Wiley Cash's website. It's wileycash.com, and look under the Shop tab. I also have links where you can go to buy a ticket posted inside this story on WECT.com. And don't forget, Halfway There is still available on the iTunes comedy chart for you to download and buy. You can follow Cliff at cliffcashcomedy.com. That's also the name he uses on social media, Cliff Cash Comedy. You can find him on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, and if you want to see more of his material, he also has a channel on YouTube. Now, before we go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Please download and subscribe to the One-on-One with John Evans podcast on whatever app you use to listen to your favorite shows. And if you would be so kind, please leave us a rating or a review. The more feedback we have from people like you, the higher we'll be listed on the apps, the better chance we'll have of bringing in even more new listeners. I'm John Evans. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of One-on-One.